Welcome aboard, and thank you for checking out the channel. This is Giants Amongst Us, where we share in the unique human experience, and where you're going to hear real stories told by real people just like yourself. Now, I know YouTube is a video-based platform, but I thought this would still be a good idea to use in order to share stories from people that I've connected with all across the world, coming from different backgrounds, having different struggles and issues, but the underlining theme is the fact that they found it within themselves, somehow, some way, and at some point to change their situation, to be accountable and responsible for their experiences. And with that came new opportunities, came new beginnings, came a rebirth, so to speak. So this channel right here is an extension of a podcast that's already available. You can find it on whichever streaming platform you like to plug into, like the Spotifys, the Deezers, the Audibles. You can find it there. Just punch in Giants Amongst Us. And there's also a website available. And you can go check out what's going on that side of the woods and see if it's something that you find valuable. And if you do, you can add it to your program. And as mentioned, this is an extension of a podcast that's already available. So if you want to listen to the conversation in its entirety, unfiltered, you can check out the links in the show notes in the description box, and it'll lead you to where you'd be able to plug in and listen to it unfiltered. But for now, what you'll find here on YouTube are bite-sized pieces, something that you could throw on in the background as you're doing whatever it is you're doing around the house. Washing, cleaning, cooking, brewing your coffee in the morning, or even as you drive to and from work, whatever your heart desires. And today, for starters, a story that I wanted to share with everybody comes from a man who was brought up as a Jehovah's Witness. He says that his indoctrination started before he was born, because as his mother was carrying him in her womb, there were tapes and there were sermons played to already start the conditioning from the fetus. Child to teenager, then to an adult, his whole world revolved around a governing body, the ruling council of Jehovah's Witness. There's a whole lot to unpack, and this man does a great job with breaking down everything in detail, from the death and the abuse that's going on in this organization. For some, it'll be an eye-opener. I know for me it was. And also the trauma that was instilled in him early on, that doomsday, the prophetic teachings of Armageddon soon to come. At an early age, this is something that was always in the back of his mind, traumatizing him to the point where he said at 10 years old, he was already suicidal. Raised as a Jehovah's Witness, his whole life revolved around that organization. And after listening to his story, I'll let you decide whether you think this is a righteous religion or a cult. Just recently, a couple of years ago, he separated himself from the organization. And because of it, he lost everything. Family, friends, the world as he knew it. Everything was pulled from him. His family and friends, they excommunicated themselves from him. The world as he knew it, stripped. But he had his truth, he had his conviction, and there was an awakening, but it came with the price. That's why he wanted to share this story. He's angry, and rightfully so. That's what we need more of. We need more of some righteous anger. So this man was eager, he was passionate about sharing light on what's really going on behind the curtain. And like I said, after listening to this, you can decide for yourself whether you see it cultish or not. Ladies and gentlemen, this is FS and his story.
Comes down to a matter of opinion on what a cult is, but I think that there's check boxes, and they check those boxes. So we can call it a cult. I was born into it. They encourage indoctrination in the womb. They encourage parents to listen to tapes and things like that out loud while they're pregnant. My indoctrination started before I was born.
How was that as a child, living with that guilt or that feeling like he's over you at all times, watching your every move?
To be honest, it made me conclude I would not get into the new world easily. I was just like, I'm not good enough. I never felt I was good enough. So I just concluded I'm not getting into the new world, which sort of led to a host of behavioral problems, because it was around this time when I started having that thought, which was like 8, 9, 10. I'm like, I'm not going to make it. I was also studying the Revelation book, which said basically the way they implied it was that the end of the world is coming like super, super fast. And I was under the distinct impression it would come before I turned 18. And this is 20 some odd years ago. They actually put it in print that the end of the world would come before the end of this century. And they did that in about 89. So I'm told that everything I'm learning in this meeting is the truth. I'm 8 years old, and they tell me that the end of the world is coming before January or December 31st, 1999. So that fear of Armageddon, of every single person who's not a JW will be destroyed, and just like living in that every single day, it's like being in The Walking Dead, man.
Wow.
It could happen any minute. Anytime there was a thunderstorm growing up, a large snowstorm, super windy days, dark clouds, that kind of shit freaked the hell out of me. I always thought it was the beginning of like this slaughter that we had all been waiting for. Like, they are an apocalyptic death cult like you would not fucking believe. It made me suicidal, big time. As a child, the first suicidal thought I had, I was 10 years old.
10 years old. There was people that were in your circle. They ended up taking their lives because of because of these type of things.
Yeah, like, I'll just cover all of the death in the organization and the things that I feel that they're responsible for. So you have in the very, very beginning, I think even before they were called Jehovah's Witnesses, they didn't adopt that name until the 20s. They were called the Bible students, but I believe, I don't remember exact dates, but there was a time where they kind of said vaccines are wrong. We're talking like polio vaccines and shit, like stuff that like the science is pretty sound on some of the vaccines that were developed back then, right? It's like, we don't have certain diseases today because of that. They denied that for a while and eventually said that was okay. So when we were talking about death, you can probably guarantee somebody died because of that teaching. In the 70s, they said that organ transplants were cannibalism, and they said you should not do it. And it was for about a 10 or 11 year period that you could pretty much guarantee some people lost their lives. And then at the end of that period, they just said, you know what, we're going to call this a conscience matter. So now if you want to get that, it's a conscience matter. And of course, every single person, there's been 0 people who've chosen to not get an organ transplant, as far as my understanding. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone knows, but I definitely call them responsible for that death, because like I'd mentioned to you before, if you only had 2 choices. You took the organ transplant and lost all of your friends and family because they would be forced to shun you, or you didn't and you died. Either way, you're suffering a physical or virtual death. And then they said that for a long time they had forbidden blood, right? So like they still do, no blood transfusions. But there was a certain point, I think in the 80s, where they said certain fractions of these blood you can take. And it was like, it opened up the door to a lot of treatment that initially, like if you see like that, all the people that might have died before that point, because that door was closed. And I find that they are definitely responsible and blood guilty for that. And they also have no biblical backing for this teaching. They just pulled it out of their ass. They're like, well, like they've talked to doctors, and every single doctor's like, whatever, like you guys are insane for these things, like saying that this blood fraction's okay, but not blood and having blood is not okay. But this like fraction of a fraction, yeah, sure, that's fine. It's like, it's all blood. It's just components of it, right? It's like, it's silly. To keep going with the deaths thing, they started to allow subcomponents of blood, and everyone who died before that, I would say that they're blood guilty for that. Another part of what I consider them blood guilty for is there's a scandal that was called the Mexico-Malawi scandal, and it came down to political identification cards and army service or something to that effect. But basically, the doctrine from the governing body, they said, no, the people in Malawi are not allowed to own or purchase a political card. Now, it was a dictatorship at that time, so basically it would be like if Putin ruled the world and he says, I want $10, and you'll get a card that says you are part of the Putin party, which you have no choice. He's a dictator. And that's what's going on in Malawi. They had to, like, everyone was under the same government. They just had to pretend like they were supporting it willingly with this card. Now, the governing body said, don't do that. And because of that, people were raped and killed. And I consider the organization responsible for those deaths and rapes. And it's a pretty horrific thing. Now, how that translates and why I mentioned Mexico is because a similar thing was going on in Mexico where I think they had to sign up for military service or something. They had to have a card that said, I did military service, but they could just bribe their way to get that card. They don't have to do any military service. They could just flip 1,000 pesos and, yeah, here, we'll give you a card that says you did it. There's a bit of a connection there saying on one end, I'm allowed to have this card saying I did something for the government. On the other end, I'm not. And people are literally dying and being raped because of that. So I would say that the organization is responsible for some horrors in that aspect. For the final moment of like what kind of deaths I would consider them responsible for is,
run it.
like I'd mentioned, I lost a few friends to suicide. People I knew personally, people I worked with for years, people who I was friends with. I went on vacation, or not vacation, but work trips with for days and days. I know these people, and they ended their life because of the shunning. They couldn't handle it. So I would say that the governing body and Jehovah's Witnesses as an organization are responsible for the orphans that were made by that, the people who lost their daughter, people who lost their brother, uncle, etc. Like all that loss, I blame the organization for. So grand total, they have a lot of death on their hands. And that concludes the full portfolio of the death.
Then we were talking about some of the things that have been known to go on in some of the cases that they've had, not even some of, but probably many, where you have children that are being abused.
I can kind of do it the same way I'd covered death from the beginning of what I'm aware of to where we're at now. So the original policies, which did a lot of damage, throughout 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, was there had to be 2 witnesses to a crime in order for the elders to take action. And since it's such a closed community, anytime crimes or accusations of crimes come up, it goes to the elders. It doesn't go to police or anyone else. It's like, we got to take this issue to the elders. So if a child went to their parent, let's say, and said, this person touched me in this way, that would go to the elders. And then the elders would form a tribunal. So they'd have 3 elders in a committee, and they would interview the child. I would hope with the parent present. I've heard of times when the parent wasn't. They would get into very explicit details, graphic details with this child. They would have to determine whether the child was a willing participant. And that's a legitimate, real thing. That was part of their instructions from Bethel, was to find out if the child was a willing participant.
Wow. No way.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking when you think of it. And disgusting, obviously.
I mean, how can a child have consent?
Exactly. So like they might say, I don't even want to get into their mental gymnastics. It's just gross. It's just gross. It's like we're talking about adults preying on children, and they still want to find out if the kid was willing. Some of these things have been kind of muted over the years, where they're probably not as intense. I'm pretty sure nowadays, every time an accusation like this comes up, the parent will be present. I don't know if that's true. I sincerely hope so. But they've also changed it so that you had 1 witness or 2 witness rule, right? Where 2 witnesses have had to be witness to this crime. So if the child said, hey, mom, somebody touched me, they could go to the elders. And it would just be a matter of this child versus this adult saying, he did this. The adult could say, no, I didn't. And that's as far as it goes. And back in the day, since it was, and it's still 2 witness rule is still abounds. Like they still go by this. If there wasn't another witness to it, the guy would just walk. And like in Australia, I mentioned to you that I think over in the last 50 years, since a certain date in the 1950s, 60s, 70s or so, there's been about 100,000 JWs in Australia, and they found that there was 1,000 plus cases of individuals accused of abuse that never, like not one of those got investigated. And that ended up being like, so 1% of JWs basically in Australia were pedophiles that never got investigated.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. And all of that came to light during the Australian Royal Commission, where they were investigated as part of the whole government investigating multiple religions. And they got grilled pretty hard. Like they lost some serious face. Like many JWs are on the Ex-JW forum because they saw what was going down in Australia. And in fact, like that's one of our primary ways to try to wake people up, is to say, you got to look into the ARC, the Australian Royal Commission, because like it'll blow your mind. You can see like the governing body, these people who are leading you, they get interviewed by judges. They're being deceptive. They're being sneaky with their language, cagey, like they won't give a straight answer, and they get like called out on it multiple times, embarrassed. Like these are people leading millions with absolute obedience, and they're embarrassing. So yeah, recommending that. So anyways, that's part of the child abuse scandal. They've also were investigated in the UK. One of the things I found interesting about the UK investigation, it was called ICSA, I believe. It was International Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, I believe. That one, they investigated a bunch of religions, and some of them actually had no child abuse problems. And it was something that was very interesting to see as a JW, because I was kind of waking up when I was reading this, and I was told, it's like, well, you can't blame the organization for child sexual abuse because it happens everywhere. And I was just seeing the statistic that no, it doesn't. Because you got to understand, JWs are true believers. They believe God chose them over anybody. I almost called them Jod. That would have been great. They believe God chose them above everybody. So all of this is like they're this special people. So they shouldn't have any child sexual abuse. And it's provable by statistics that there are organizations without it. So how do you tell me that your religion is the one true religion? And then they also tell you that all of the religions are controlled by Satan. So somehow Satan can run a religion without child sexual abuse, but Jehovah can't, right? And that's the main reason why they don't want people looking into these things. They don't want people questioning the doctrine, starting to questioning the governing body, because literally you pull a thread, man, and that sweater comes apart like you paid $5 for it. It's like their doctrine falls apart so insanely fast that their only hope is extreme information control. So Pennsylvania did happen earlier this year. Yeah, I'll go through that actually. So basically, I think there was 14 plus JWs. Some of them were elders that were arrested for, pedophilia, and it's an ongoing investigation. One of the guys ended his life before he could get arrested. So you can take that as a innocent or guilty plea. I'll leave that up to you. So yeah, I was going to say, this is an ongoing investigation. They set up their own phone number for this investigation. So they said, if you are a JW and you've experienced anything, it doesn't matter where you're from. They wanted to hear from people any part of the country. It's just starting to unfold. But some of the facts that were interesting from this case, I mentioned to you before that, obviously obedience is a huge thing. Obedience to the governing body, and they talk about obedience to elders, and they want you to mirror that. The same amount of obedience you would give to your leaders should be the same as what you give to these elders. And why that was a dangerous thing is because some of these pedophiles ended up being elders, and they were using situations within the congregation to isolate and abuse children. JWs oftentimes say that the child sexual abuse within their organization is not institutional, like the Catholics, where you would have kids dropped off at Sunday school and there's 20 kids around a priest. Obviously, you can molest one. So they say, yeah, we're not like that. But what they do have is these service groups where they'll have 20 people and then they'll break off into groups of 4. And oftentimes, back in the 80s especially, parents would let their kids just go with an elder, go with whoever, because they trusted them, implicitly trusted them. And part of the reason why they implicitly trust them is because JWs believe elders are literally appointed by Holy Spirit, that the Holy Spirit has something to do with them getting assigned as an elder in their congregation. So if you combine Holy Spirit appointed with, I want you to obey them as much as you obey the leaders, and then you combine that with a JW pedophile who's preying on these kids in these service groups, it just amounts to one big disgusting clusterfuck, I guess. I don't know what else to say. I'm just mentioning kind of the big issues. They've gone through some class action lawsuits. I think there's one going on in Canada, in Quebec, I believe. An interesting thing that just came up is, I believe it's New Zealand is investigating. They're doing a similar thing to what the UK did with ICSA and Australia with Australian Royal Commission. They're doing basically a countrywide investigation into churches and their institutional abuse. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses, this interesting fact, are the only ones who were being counted as being investigated who tried to get out of it. They actually sued to get out of being investigated for child abuse. And they lost, thankfully, and will be included in the investigation. But it just shows the level of arrogance these people have. Even with the admissions in Australia of how many pedophiles they let slip through the net, how many children got re-abused and abused worse because they let them off, because you need that 2-witness rule again. It's just insidious, man. Like,
once you woke up and you said, you know what, F this, I'm out, and you wrote your letter, I don't know, is it safe to say you had no outside friends, no worldly friends beside every people in the organization?
that's exactly what they're called. They're called worldly friends. They call worldly people, and you are encouraged to not make friends with them. I followed that encouragement, so I had never had a single worldly friend. Like I've made a few friends over, gaming, and a few
So you had to start from scratch.
Oh, I'm still at scratch, man.
Wow. This was how long ago?
It's a couple of years ago since I've disassociated, but it's like it's very hard when you're like, I'm quite middle-aged-ish, but it's like you don't have a single friend. COVID is around.
Yeah.
It's extremely isolating. My closest friend was the guy who ran the convenience store next to me for a few years, because it's like that's all I had.
You're already out, you're physically out, you're mentally out, but what have you found to help you? Like you said, you're at scratch, you're at level 0, starting back up. I mean, you have any things that are helping you build and just, move forward?
Yeah, and here's where I would love to give advice to anybody who's in that situation, but I don't have a ton, because the truth is it's honestly incredibly difficult to start from scratch. One of the things that makes it really hard is all of a sudden these people that you looked at that were worldly, that were dangerous, possibly under the influence of Satan, are now your only friends and family. And trying to drop that veil, that screen you see, that lens you see through, where I see you as a worldly person, as somebody who's potentially dangerous, potentially trying to lead me into trouble. It takes a long time to drop that lens and learn to trust people who were not Jehovah's Witnesses. That's all you can now. And it's a very difficult thing. Like I did kind of start to make one friend, and he like scared me a little, because like he, was showing some different sides to himself. And it's just like, I'm like, oh, is this like, and it just kind of knocks you back, because it reminds you of your training. Like these people are dangerous to you. So it's like that immediate trigger like made me think, oh, this person's dangerous. But I wrote it out, and it's just like, he's just the same as everybody else. We all have our faults, whatever, right? And it's like, that's all it was. It was just like my initial reaction was the pre-programming. So it is a little bit to get past that pre-programming and to start to trust people and start to really be a human again. Because JWs, they are not really humans. They essentially have any potential, any desires, any worldly desires, any desire to grow as a human being is scooped out of them. And what's placed in them is a watchtower salesman who is going to wait for God to do stuff for them. So they just wait, and they preach, and they go to meetings, and they wait, and they preach, and they go to meetings. There's no soul. Yeah. There's no life.
Thanks for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed some of this conversation. And like I said, if you want to listen to it in its entirety, feel free to head on over to giantsamongustus.com or to follow that link, which will send you to whichever streaming platform you like to plug into. And feel free to leave any thoughts, feedback, or add something to the conversation in the comments below. That's always welcome. And if you found any value in this at all, be sure to stick around. There will be more. We'll be sure to catch up next time. And one more thing, if you would like to be a part of the show and share your story, or even a story of someone in your life that has impacted you in a positive way, you could always reach out to me via email. I'd be happy to connect. Until next time, and very soon. Peace.
Looking for a sign to know I'm on the right road. Ain't seen no sign since Jericho.